How's everybody doing? This is the topic analysis for framework and critical positions on the November-December topic. Resolved in a democracy, the public's right to know ought to be valued above the right to privacy of candidates for public office. So while this topic has been much maligned, to say the least, there are we got to deal with it, and there are certainly some positions on a variety of different areas that are worth talking about. So we'll jump right in. I guess for starters, we should talk about what some of the central controversies of the topic will um, end up coming down to. So, as you can tell based on just a cursory glance at the resolution, there is a conflict posited between two different rights, whether there should be a right to privacy or if there should be a right to know for the public. So the most intuitive way of reading the resolution will center on whether or not one of those rights should be prioritized over the other. The affirmative would attempt to prove that this right to know should be prioritized over this right to privacy, and the negative would try to prove the converse of that resolution, that the right to privacy should be prioritized over the right to know. And I think many debaters who ascribe to a very comparative worlds type understanding of what debate should look like will find that intuitive. That the affirmative says that one should be prioritized over the other, the negative has a burden of rejoinder of demonstrating that the other one should be prioritized instead. The second understanding of the resolution that some people might adopt is that the affirmative has made a truth claim that one right ought to be prioritized over the other, and the negative merely needs to demonstrate that right does not should not be prioritized. And the key distinction here is that the negative could reasonably claim as germane negative ground, not that privacy is a better right, but problematize the idea of rights to begin with, which I think is a kind of a non-sketchy application of more truth testing-esque type arguments to justify either some framework NCs, for example, communitarianism type positions about the idea of individualistic understandings of rights being bad, or even positions like the Hobbes NC that says, no, we should not be prioritizing right A over right B because rights should not exist to begin with, or critical positions. And I think thinking about the topic with that understanding in mind of what the resolution does mean and how people from different schools of thought might approach it differently is a very useful jumping off point for starting your reading into the topic. So we're going to talk about framework apps, framework negs, critical apps, and critical negs. We'll start by talking about some framework apps. The first, and I think one of the more common apps that people will be reading, is so whether or not you decide to read this yourself or just it's good to know about because you could certainly be debating it, is a Kantian affirmative. So most people are familiar with Kant, but the TLDR of Bayont is that the ends don't justify the means. That whereas utilitarian theories prioritize happiness, pain, like minimizing pain, maximizing pleasure, the main good that deontologists try to achieve is about respecting agency and acknowledging the fundamental rationality of all people. That part of someone's status as an agent is the ability to reason and to be able to derive ethical solutions or being able to just make decisions as being a rational agent, and therefore the choices that one individual makes should respect the agency and the rationality of others as well. And that this is again not aggregative. It's not about producing some type of good effect, but rather it's about whether or not it's consistent with understandings of respecting agency at a fundamental level. So there's one aspect of Kantian philosophy some people wrote about called the publicity principle. So what Kant meant by this is that any action that is taken by an individual in private is not justified if it would have been unjustified in public. So, for example, me bad mouthing someone, if I said it to their face, that would be not cool. Um, but if that were done in private and they didn't know about it, it would still be bad because it would have been bad for the same thing in public. This is necessary but not sufficient, i.e., any action that is justified in public does not necessarily make it justified in private, but an action that is unjustified in public is always unjustified in private. So the way that this offense would function is fairly intuitive. That that there's really an artificial divide between the public and the private, and that officials or candidates for office need to surrender themselves to the judgment of the people and should be accountable for whatever they do. And it doesn't make sense to say they're immune from wrongdoing because of the fact that they are separate from the public. Rather, because they're separate from the public. Rather, any actions they take should be subject to scrutiny in public as well. Some objections to this. There's one article that I found that says this principle does not apply to officials because they put themselves in a different capacity. In that it's not the same thing as just a public-private divide as an ordinary citizen, but rather they've taken on specific obligations as a leader. I think many Kantians would likely respond that it doesn't matter what type of identity you find for yourself, you still fundamentally have an identity as an agent, and that a rational agent and their obligations may differ slightly, but they still have the same basic starting point of um, something that all agents have to follow as well. So I think this app could be strategic. I think the main strategic function of a lot of apps is going to be getting out of the inevitable case dump, or at least framework apps, getting out of the inevitable case dump that greater media scrutiny or greater public accountability doesn't actually reduce corruption, lead to better policies, etc., etc. Um, I think this is strategic because it doesn't rely on winning that. You just have to win that you are consistent with some type of uh, ethical system that prioritizes accountability over other ends. The second type of framework AF would be a virtue ethics AF. Again, fairly straightforward. The argument is that there are several virtues such as like courage, modesty, justice, selflessness, etc., that are intrinsically good, and that people should aim to inculcate among themselves and among others, and that the role of the state should be to inculcate virtue among its citizenry, and that it's important for people to try to act in a manner that's consistent with uh, virtuous actions. And that if officials are able to, or candidates for office are able to not disclose what they've done, it's very difficult to inculcate a virtue among the government because then people don't know who they're voting for. They don't know what other people have done, which makes it very difficult to create a government with values that we know we like. If there's no premium placed on making sure these types of values are transparent. Likely, this position would also, similar to the Kantian one, collapse to some extent the divide between the public and private, and that fundamentally virtues are virtues, no matter who you are or what role you take. You still have a responsibility to be virtuous. I think another flavor of this position could be about corruption. That the only possible way to ensure that the government is maximally accountable is to enable candidates who are elected to be especially scrupulous in terms of knowing what they've done and being able to not choose not to vote for them if it seems likely to be corrupt. My only concern with that would be that it gets a little bit close into consequentialist territory about winning that actually reduces corruption, which would be defeat the purpose of reading a position that is a little bit more framework oriented. Um, Third and final one would be pragmatism, which I actually think could be very interesting on this topic. The argument being that the pragmatism framework says that basically that we should reject foundational understandings of truth and ethics, that um, there's no one understanding of what morality should look like, and that we should not try to deduce one, but rather ethics aims at basically certain inquiries that are practical. So the starting point of like ethics is a problem solution mentality. Like I will try to invent a light because it is dark and I want to see. And therefore we should orient our ethics around specific problems and experimentation as opposed to transcendental understandings of truth. So a pragmatist would likely say that ideas of democracy and experimentation with different theories are good and public input, and that the only way to ensure that is for people to know as much about public officials as possible to be able to more effectively vote vote for officials, excuse me, once they know the most about them. Similar to the second version of the virtue ethics framework, my concern would just be that this might be a little bit close to consequentialism in that it's about a result of this being pragmatic. But I think there's a way to explain this by focusing on how it's just an orientation towards experimentation that would not necessarily be consequentialist. Um, yeah, that's all there is about the framework apps. Let's move on to framework negs. I think this is where the divide between rejecting rights altogether and prioritizing one over the other uh, really starts to diverge, and I think could be very useful. So the first would be a defense of privacy being more important than the public's right to know, which would be the libertarianism and libertarianism NC. So libertarianism, as many of you know, says basically non-interference good. We don't want the government intruding in our affairs. Um, Taxation is a violation of freedom. Best government is a minimal government, and that it's an incredibly intrusive understanding of the government to basically grant the public a right to know and to require citizens to divulge information. So like genetic information to just their medical records, that there's no right to know any of that. And I think creating a divide between positive and negative rights will be very helpful here. Positive rights being something that you're entitled to from the government, such as healthcare, education, uh, nice roads, etc., and negative rights, i.e., rights to freedom, non-interference. Libertarians strongly prefer the former to the latter, or I'm sorry, the latter to the former, and problematize conceptions of positive rights. I think the second position, the Hobbesiancy, problematizes the idea of rights in general, that the idea of the state is meant to provide security as opposed to rights for people, that people join the state because the state of nature is terrible and they can never have any rights in the state of nature. So as a result, they join the state. And because of the fact that the state of nature is worse than anything the state can do, the state has absolute control and ability to do whatever it wants, and there's no ability for citizens to question that. And that rights appeal to an idea of non interference, or the idea of people being able to carve out some sphere within the state to be protected from the state, which is inconsistent with a state that is a leviathan, i.e., it's just an absolute state that can do whatever it wants. I think the resolutional context of a democracy is very interesting here, and I think that can cut both ways. It can help the app because you can say that in a democracy there are already checks on the state to some extent, which means that it's not truly a Hobbesian state. But you can also, which would mean the negative doesn't really have uniqueness. But I think, in contrast, the negative could argue that, well, no, it's not a question of like creating a perfectly Hobbesian state, but just whether or not rights are good or bad in a vacuum, and the negative rejects that understanding of rights. But the fact that it's in a democracy means that it would never devolve into totalitarianism. I think advantage counterplans also will be very strategic here, in that a lot of apps will be more of just an FYI that the public should know things, and the negative could functionally just kick out of giving a right and do other things that increase transparency and accountability. I think one very promising one would be some type of restrictions on what elected officials can do, or oversight of elected officials, but not giving a public right to know about candidates. Some of the net benefits could be stuff about how vesting it within the candidate is bad. It's extremely intrusive. It knows people's medical records, private information. So privacy good could certainly be a net benefit to that. Um, Moving on to some critical affirmatives. I think the most common ones will just be more soft lefty. People need to know things to check the government. This government's militarized, tons of corruption under Trump, etc. And it's important people to know more about the state, which is fairly intuitive. There are also, I'm sure, excellent neg cards out there about how this oversight doesn't work, is actively detrimental, slows down the government, kind of ossifies the ability for the government to create effective policies, etc. Um, but I think in terms of much more left KFs, so I think there's a decent chance that some people say they don't like the topic and that they will not defend this topic because they don't like it. Uh, just considering how much backlash there has been about the topic, I can see a situation in which some people will just read a different out from a different topic, or at least heavily answer T by saying this topic is not tenable, it wasn't democratically selected, etc. In which case, the obvious negative defense of T needs to be about predictable limits. That no matter what you like about the topic, it is still, whether you like it or not, it is still the only predictable jumping off point, and that ad hoc decisions to debate a different topic are totally unpredictable. And I think finally, some apps might talk about the importance of people being able to surveil the government and have oversight over the government, which is something that some authors have dubbed the synopticon, which is the flip side of the panopticon, where the government surveils people. The synopticon is the few surveilling or the many surveilling the few and looking in on the government, and that a public right to know is a way of kind of inverting that decision calculus that prioritizes the public being watched by the government. So there could be some interesting legalism slash biopower literature about that being an effective means of checking the state. The final critical neg, the section is about critical negs. That's a picture of Lewis Gordon, who is always going to come in handy for answering pessimism. So the first thing to keep in mind is that on any topic, people will find a way to read their generic prep. People like being able to read the same Ks, so people always find ways to read pessimism and the like. The app defends an idea, an understanding of rights. They defend the state doing something, etc. And implicitly or otherwise, these critiques basically adopt the second reading of the resolution, which views it not as a burden of rejoinder, i.e., the neg needing to prove a different system of rights desirable, but rather a rejection of rights in general. And I think there is a fairly compelling theory argument the app can make that, excuse me, the negative does need to present to meet their burden of rejoinder and defend the converse of the resolution. I think 1K in particular that's very interesting was going to be ableism of this topic, that forcing people to disclose their medical records leads to stigmatization of people who have certain ailments. A great example of this is in the 1972 presidential election. The running mate of George McGovern revealed that he had been diagnosed with depression several years ago and was then pressured to step down as a result after revealing his medical diagnosis, which is discrimination against people who suffer from depression and leads to that being stigmatized throughout society. So I think the negative can certainly problematize the idea of unfettered disclosure of public information as being an incredibly able-bodied assumption that all people have nothing they would feel uncomfortable divulging. The final main genre of Ks would be Ks of rights that basically criticize the idea of protecting something by viewing it through the lens of an undeniable thing that each person is endowed with. And I think very similar to September, October, a lot of these would be much more in the legalism vein, that rights ignored, they can always be suspended when the state wants them to be, that it's impossible for there to ever be any guarantee, and that this constitutes naive faith in the system, and that instead it's better to think outside of the categories of the law and to try to create alternate conditions of possibilities that are not limited by the legal system itself. And I think there's some interesting clash definitely between that and the legalism app that I outlined before. Are these rights something that are good for checking the state, or is that idea just inherently tainted by the idea that it is a right, which is granted by the state? I think we'll likely see a lot more of the neg side of this than the app side in terms of how the topic plays out, but I think being on top of both and potentially researching both can be useful. So as always, message any of us if you have any questions about the topic or any of the specific things that are discussed in this video or others. But overall, it looks like it'll be an interesting topic and some good literature out there. So have fun researching.